sometimes fan bases can get caught up in the moment and they can kind of lose themselves a little bit and they can get caught up in the present and forget where they've come from and more importantly where their teams have come from. And when I think about the Cincinnati Bengals and I think about Marvin Lewis, I know fans for a number of years now of the Bengals, and yes, I guess they actually do exist, have been calling for a change at the head coaching position, saying it's time for Marvin Lewis to go, and blah, blah, blah. And, it's one of these things where continuity goes a long way. It really, truly does. Like, you look just within the Bengals' own division, the AFC North. You're talking about the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have had 3 head coaches since 1969. Chuck Noll, Bill Cowher, Mike Tomlin. In that time, they've made it to 8 Super Bowls and they've won 6 of them. So there's something to be said about continuity. Even you look at the Baltimore Ravens. Billick was there for a long time and he won a Super Bowl. John Harbaugh has been there since 2008. They also have a Super Bowl trophy from his time and several other playoff appearances, and meaningful playoff appearances at that. Where on the flip side, you look at the lack of continuity, and you look at the Cleveland Browns. Since they came back into being for the 1999 season, they've had a total of 9 head coaches. When you throw an interim coach in there, 9 head coaches, and only 2 winning seasons. Only 2 winning seasons, mind you, out of 18 seasons. 2 out of 18. That's what? Horrible. Like 11.1% of their seasons have been winning seasons and only 1 playoff appearance. So in 18 seasons, this is an organization with 9 head coaches, averaging a head coach every 2 years when you extrapolate that out, has made exactly 1 playoff appearance. And I think it's easy to forget that as bad as the Browns are now, and were that crappy organization for the past decade or so, and are the standard bearer of how not to do things in the NFL, in the 90s, it was the Cincinnati Bengals, the Bruce Coslets of the world, the Dick LeBeaus of the world. They used to be called the Bungles for a reason. And they weren't always the Bungles. They made a Super Bowl trip with Forrest Gregg as their head coach and Ken Anderson as their quarterback in the 81 season. Then you look at the 88 season, of course, and you got that Sam Weiss team with Boomer Esiason at quarterback. So this is a Bengals organization that was solid in the 80s. 2 Super Bowl appearances. It just unfortunately ran up against Joe Montana both times. So you get to the 90s and they're terrible. You miss on Kajana Carter, David Klingler, and then to cap off the decade, Achilles Smith. I mean, this was a bad organization. Really, really bad. And when Marvin Lewis took over at the start of the 2003 season, you bring him in, you're bringing in your young future franchise quarterback in Carson Palmer. It took time, but eventually there was a change in culture. And there was a change in the way the Bengals did business. And ultimately, a change of the feelings surrounding the Bengals and their organization. People will call them the Bungles now. But these are not the Bungles. The Bungles were the 90s Bengals. When you're talking about in Marvin Lewis's 14 seasons, he has a winning record, 117, 103, and 3 ties. He's enjoyed success with 2 different starting quarterbacks in Carson Palmer and Andy Dalton. A team that in 14 seasons has made the playoffs 7 times, won 4 division titles, 6 seasons of 10 or more wins, and coming off of a recent stretch between 2011 and 2015 where they made 5 straight playoff appearances. Those are not Bungles. I wish my Bears had that track record of success over the past 14 years in some aspects. This is a team that has played some winning football. This is a team that has made several trips to the playoffs. Half of these seasons that Marvin Lewis has been in charge of this team, they have made a playoff appearance. So we can focus on some of these things about what they don't do, but I think it's important to remember what Marvin Lewis has done and how he has changed the culture of the Bengals organization and has made them into a decent organization, a quality organization, no longer a laughingstock of the NFL. You can make fun of the Bengals if you want, but they a laughingstock they are no longer. No longer. And that in large part is due to Marvin Lewis, period. So I think sometimes it's easy to crap on the guy because you haven't won playoff games, because you haven't made it to a Super Bowl, because you haven't won a world championship. But in the grand scheme of things, to be completely fair, nobody gave a shit about the Bengals in the 90s other than them being a punchline. People actually care about the Bengals now. They're a relevant organization. And sometimes be careful what you wish for. Making change for the sake of change is not always productive or successful. Sometimes the grass may appear greener, but it ultimately is not greener on the other side. With all of that said, though, there comes a point in time where change is needed. We're talking about a Marvin Lewis now. We're 14 seasons in to his tenure as the Cincinnati Bengals head coach. He's the second longest tenured head coach with his team in the NFL behind who? Bill Belichick. Now, whereas Bill Belichick in his 17 seasons now, and we haven't even gotten to the end of this season to know how this plays out, but in his first 16 years, made trips to 6 Super Bowls, won 4 Super Bowls, has run that division of the AFC East for a decade and a half. Marvin Lewis is second behind him in tenure in the league, and Marvin Lewis has exactly 0 playoff wins in 14 seasons. 0. Just think about that. Bill Belichick has lost more Super Bowls than Marvin Lewis has won playoff games. And that's very striking when you're comparing tenures of coaches. Now, maybe it's a thing where Mike Brown is very loyal, the owner of the Bengals, and loyal to a fault. But sometimes loyalty's got to go out the door. And you think about a Mike Brown who I think is like 80, 81 now. You would hope that you would want to see your team win a championship at some point in time before you croak. I mean, to put it bluntly. I mean, I get the fear of if you get rid of a Marvin Lewis, you're afraid that you'll go back to being the Bengals. But it doesn't have to be like that at all. What I can tell you is, and we've had 14 years to prove this out, is Marvin Lewis is not the guy that's going to get the job done and get you to a Super Bowl, let alone help you win one. It might be a tough decision to make, but it is the right and only decision to make. When you look at a team that, when you're talking, and again, when we're talking about a guy like Marvin Lewis here, 7 times they've made the playoffs, half the time they haven't. So it's been like a raging success. Again, 0 playoff wins since 2003 when he took over. 0 playoff wins in 7 trips. That's an 0-7 record in the playoffs. That's with Carson Palmer as a starter. That's with Andy Dalton as a starter. And while it became kind of in vogue and cool to knock Andy Dalton for not winning in the playoffs, Marvin Lewis's history of not winning playoff games predates Andy Dalton. And you also look at a team that at times can play like knuckleheads. They could be undisciplined. They could really shoot themselves in the foot. That can be a direct reflection of coaching. And you look at a Marvin Lewis, and maybe a Marvin Lewis is the type of guy that could come in and turn a program around and get you to a certain point, but he's not the guy to get you over the hump, similar to a Tony Dungy. Like, I know Tony Dungy ended up being a head coach that got enshrined in Canton. He is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And people will point to his time in Indianapolis and winning the Super Bowl championship with Peyton Manning as what made him a Hall of Famer. To me, for my money, remembering how bad the Bucs were for so many years, the turnaround job he did in Tampa Bay is, to me, what made him almost worthy alone of being a Hall of Famer. Because people could remember now the Warren Sapp, Derek Brooks, John Lynch, Rondé Barber team. They forget how bad the Bengals were the Buccaneers were of the 90s with Trent Dilfer and Eric Rhett and Rydell Anthony and overpaying for Alvin Harper and free agency. I remember this crap. Tony Dungy changed the culture of that organization, but you got to a point in time where you could not go any further with him. They bring in John Gruden. That very first season he's there, he wins them, takes them to the Super Bowl. They win the Super Bowl. That kind of petered out afterwards, I will grant you. But at the end of the day, they got the Lombardi Trophy. The Glazer family made the right decision. Malcolm Glazer made the right call. Tony Dungy was the guy that turned the program around, to change the culture. John Gruden was the icing on the cake that took him to that final step. Marvin Lewis is kind of like Tony Dungy in that sense to me, where maybe he would go to another team that wasn't as bad off, but needed some type of culture change to go from here to here. And maybe that's where he could be and be able to win playoff games and potentially get to a Super Bowl. But it's not coming in Cincinnati. We've had 14 years to find out that's the case. It's crazy. And this talk of Marvin Lewis saying he intends to return in 2017, to me, that's great and that's wonderful. But if I'm Mike Brown, the owner of the Bengals, I can't allow that to happen. How many more years are you going to waste with Marvin Lewis? And I hate to say waste, because you're talking about a guy who does have a winning record over his tenure. You have lots of playoff appearances. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't result in a Lombardi trophy or progressing towards a Lombardi trophy, it is a waste. And the Bengals now, after 5 straight years of making the playoffs and getting bounced in the first round, they're going the wrong way. You hang on to Marvin Lewis another year or two, you're going to be staring at the door of a 3-13, 4-12 season and looking at completely, totally having to rebuild, and then you will end up being the Bengals. I've heard some people talk about Marvin Lewis being the Black Jeff Fisher. You know, there's some truth to that, but here's the difference. Between Houston and Tennessee, looking at Jeff Fisher from his time just with the Oilers/Titans organization, not factoring in the Rams, he had a little bit over 16 seasons. His won-loss record was a little bit better in terms of percentage. While he only made the playoffs 6 times and won fewer division titles than 3 compared to Marvin Lewis's 4 in less time, Jeff Fisher also went 5-6 in the playoffs and took a team to a Super Bowl appearance in Super Bowl 34, a game that they were this close to potentially tying, literally like this close to potentially tying and send to overtime, and who knows what happens. Jeff Fisher could have a Super Bowl trophy for all the people that want to shit on him all the time, and understandably so. But sometimes we forget the perspective here. So frankly, Marvin Lewis doesn't sniff Jeff Fisher's Tennessee Titans jockstrap, because Jeff Fisher has playoff victories. Jeff Fisher has an AFC championship. Jeff Fisher has a Super Bowl appearance. Marvin Lewis has none of that. And in terms of long tenured coaches, having a guy that's there for a long time is potentially a good thing. But if a guy flat out stinks and you keep him too long, that's not good. But if the guy is only mediocre to average and you keep him for a really, really long time, that's only going to be somewhat productive either. Like I think of a recent example, Tom Coughlin, a guy who frankly for the Giants in his 12 seasons, there was a lot of mediocre to bad football there. But what did he do? He won 2 Super Bowls during his time. So it's hard to just kick the guy to the curb. In fact, the Giants waited too damn long because they had to take 4 straight seasons of not making the playoffs before they sent him packing. Then they promote Ben McAdoo, and look, the Giants are going to the playoffs. And it could be a threat in the playoffs. Maybe they should have pulled that trigger a year or 2 before, but at least, again, Tom Coughlin had 2 Super Bowl trophies in his trophy case. He had credibility. Mike Tomlin, again, looking in that division, he's been there with the Steelers 10 years. He's been to 2 Super Bowls, won one of them. John Harbaugh, 9 years in Baltimore. 1 Super Bowl, and he won it. I look at somebody else like a Lovie Smith. He had 9 years in Chicago, and he made it to a Super Bowl and made it to another NFC championship game. He didn't have as many playoff appearances as Marvin Lewis, but at least his playoff appearances mattered. At least Lovie Smith won playoff games. And that's something that Marvin Lewis can't do. And why do I say that? Because we've had 14 years to find out that he ultimately can't get the job done. Look, I respect Marvin Lewis. I think he's a decent head coach. But I don't think he's a championship head coach. And after almost a decade and a half in Cincinnati, why do you need any longer for him to be the head guy to not win you a championship, or let alone win you a playoff game? Playoffs? That's what it's about. Getting to the playoffs, winning in the playoffs, and then ultimately getting to a Super Bowl and winning a Super Bowl. The only thing the Bengals can do, and they didn't do it this year, is get to the playoffs. That's only one step in the journey, Mike Brown. You have to want more. And while I'm sure you love and respect Marvin Lewis tremendously, you can love and respect him and realize it's time for a change. I love and respect Lovie Smith quite a bit. But back then, it was time for a change. It is time for a change for the Cincinnati Bengals before they fall into being the Bungles again.